Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience as I was working through the technical difficulties. Today just happened to be a unique day where I was not in my office because we are during our construction period, so I'm bouncing back and forth between that and meetings today. But thank you very much for allowing us this opportunity to present our Pom Pom Road Habitat Restoration Project to you. I'll be starting this presentation just discussing some of those documents that led us to choosing Pom Pom as a priority project, as well as how it is in line with a lot of those strategies in those documents, and a little bit more of the history of the land prior to development and agricultural use. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Danielle. And then we're going to skip this one because this is for Tribal Council. So the next slide should be titled Yakama Reservation Watersheds Project. And what this is showing is some of those documents as well as goals of our program, Yakama Reservation Watershed Project, to support restoration within the reservation. Pom Pom Habitat is part of YRWP and the Toppenish Creek Corridor Enhancement Plan. YRWP has been funded by BPA since 1996, and it not only focuses on Toppenish, but Status and Tandem Creeks with a watershed approach.
Hey, Shawna,
The Toppenish Corridor. What?
Sorry, what slide should I be on?
Oh, you should be on the slide that says Yakama Reservation's Watershed Project. Slide 3.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, sorry. If I'm talking too fast, tell me to slow down. And then the TCC-EP was funded through the USBR, and it was established in 2019. It has the same goals and objectives as YRWP, but it does focus on irrigation impacted areas of Lower Toppenish and Simcoe Creek. So that's why the corridor plan itself is not the only thing that is funding and supporting the Pom Pom Habitat Project. Next slide. So Upper Toppenish Creek did have an assessment done in 2014. It was completed by Interfluve, and they documented the existing conditions. And what they found with this assessment between Only Dam to Shaker Church Road is that the stream cover, the riparian zone, and the floodplain connection to the channels were incredibly poor, and that these needed to be priority reaches to restore first. The initial proposal, which has led to a lot of confusion, not only within the reservation, but with funding partners and those of you that we have talked to consistently since 2019, is that we were going to remove an entire section of Pom Pom Road and close it permanently to allow Toppenish Creek to meander where she wanted to and to restore the stream habitat and processes. We had a big focus on removing this road because there was an existing bridge and a culvert as fish passage barriers, and it wasn't built well enough to withstand a lot of the flows that can come from Toppenish Creek, especially during snow melt. And this road is a county road, so it was constructed, and it really wasn't something that Yakama Nation themselves put in. So we just wanted to remove it, but we had direction from leadership and the community, especially with concerns about removing it. So the road is going to stay, but we are going to improve the infrastructure with a larger bridge and realign the main channel into a historic flow path that are supported with some data collection and historic maps that we have that I'll cover in a couple slides. So the next slide, Danielle. So this is one map. Unfortunately, there was another map that I had to show the location of Pom Pom if you're not very familiar with the reservation. The yellow star is showing where our site is located, and it is approximately 4 miles south of White Swan. And if you look closely at the map, there's also Yakama and Highway 82 to help with reference of where it is located on Toppenish Creek. Next slide. So the Toppenish Creek fan, this map is kind of showing what historically would have happened across the landscape if we didn't have road prisms and land uses that would have impacted it. This still does exist today, obviously, but it's highly impacted by that infrastructure. Toppenish Creek main stem originates up in the closed area of the reservation and the Lost Horse Plateau. or plateau, however you want to pronounce that word. And it flows through a canyon, and at the bottom left corner of this map where Toppenish Creek comes out of that canyon, it spreads out into that alluvial fan, and those are designated as two separate things on the fan. First, we have this drier zone that is identified with purple lines showing the flow path of the creek as it approaches the 1040 spring line. Downstream of the 1040 spring line is where we have our wetter zone, where there are springs originating that are popping back up into those flow paths. And some of these areas are even indicated in bright green stretches for healthier riparian habitat and healthier conditions versus the drier zone upstream, where there are channels that often dry up. And you can see Pom Pom is below the 1040 spring line, designated by a red star. So that is showing that it can have a lot of benefits with that water coming back up, not only for the habitat, but for the fishes that we want to target. Next slide, please.
Hey, Shawna,
So
just so I'm, is 1040, is that an elevation? What is the 1040 referring to?
Yeah, elevation.
Okay, thanks.
So on slide 7 should be the first GLO map, Danielle.
So
Okay.
Shawna, hold on. These slides are in a little bit different of an order.
Oh no. Okay.
I'm struggling a little bit to hit the one that you are on. The next slide after the map that you just discussed is the historic channel locations.
Yes, that is correct. The
Okay.
first GLO map with the red line?
It's an aerial, but it has red lines on it.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. I'm sorry. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone. This is the first of 3 GLO maps that we have that shows the alignment of Toppenish Creek in reference to where it currently stands today. Toppenish Creek's current main stem is outlined in the blue line. The yellow stretch on Pom Pom Road is a section that we will be improving the infrastructure on. And then the red lines were the flow path of Toppenish Creek over multiple channels and branches in 1874. This is the first one that we had access to, and as you can see, it doesn't extend all the way up above Pom Pom Road to Signal Peak Road to the left of this aerial photo. But what it is showing is that those branches are further north than where the current alignment of Toppenish Creek is, and that's important to note. Go ahead to the next slide. On this historic channel location, it was from 1885. Again, it's showing that there still are those multiple branches of Toppenish Creek, and it still isn't in the same alignment of where Toppenish is today. It's a little bit closer in some sections, and that just has to do with the elevation of the landscape, but it is still going to the north through that dense and healthier riparian vegetation that you can see on this aerial view. Next slide. This is the last GLO map from 1919. Pink is Toppenish Creek again, overlaying the current main stem in the light blue. This does have a really similar pathway to where it is today. So it is our belief that between 1885 and 1919 that something had to have been done to move Toppenish Creek to the south where it is today. And we know that something had to have been done to move her to the south because this portion is much higher in elevation compared to the northern floodplain where that vegetation is. Where the vegetation is to the north, it is much lower in elevation. And as we all know, water goes past least resistance, it's going to go downhill, it's going to go down in that elevation. So it had to have been moved, and the theory behind that is one with the construction of the road and the bridge is that it helped to put the creek where they wanted it to go through the bridge, as well as open up more landscape in the allotments for agricultural use to reduce flooding for nearby homes that are on a terrace to the north of the project site. And that is why Toppenish Creek is where it is today. Next slide. So this map this photo is a little busy, but it is just showing all of those GLO map lines, 1874 to 1919, Toppenish Creek's current alignment, and it's overlaying a LiDAR map showing, not LiDAR, the elevation to show that the historic channels are still there on the landscape. And so there is a particular scar or channel that still exists in the landscape that branches off from the blue line that then connects up to Pom Pom Road a little bit north of where Toppenish Creek is today. And so we want to bump the creek back over there through that healthier riparian vegetation. Next slide. So on this slide, it's just showing some of those current conditions today. They're very beautiful. It is like a canyon or a fire hose is what we always compare it to. The picture on the left is the south channel upstream of the bridge, and we have incision upwards of 15 to 20 feet in some of those sections. The middle picture is using me for scale, and I'm just under 5'5", and that's actually a portion of the creek that doesn't have as deep of incision as some of the other areas. And you can see it's completely barren of vegetation. There is no in-stream habitat complexity. It's just a straight shot. There's nothing there for any life stage, really, of salmonids or even lamprey, as we want to target them as well. And the picture on the very right is the south channel downstream of the bridge. It's similar conditions. The incision starts to lessen as it approaches more roads and bridges downstream of our project reach. And there's a little bit of some riparian trees, but there's only one row of them that you can see that is kind of hanging over this creek here. Next slide. This slide is just showing documented steelhead reds from 2001 to 2021. This is done every year, and the survey reds are shown as yellow circles. But you can see that there is no spawning in the inside channel section that we want to address today. So keeping in mind those pictures from the previous slide and seeing how nothing is spawning in there, this was a huge indicator that something is very wrong, and that in order to get spawning to occur, as well as support other life stages of steelhead, we really need to do something and soon. Next slide, please. So this is moving more into the goals, objectives, and constraints of this project. The overall goals is we want to increase the abundance and quality of fish and lamprey habitat. When I say fish, really, every time I say that, I'm talking about Middle Columbia steelhead as our primary target, but we want to have a holistic approach for these restoration projects, because what we can do to improve our targeted species can also improve conditions for others. We want to accommodate the habitat forming and sustaining stream processes. We don't want to have to go in year after year to do additional management or adaptive management. We want the stream to be able to do her own thing. Next slide. So we're going to increase the channel to floodplain connection, have more of that frequent natural flooding. We're going to increase in-channel complexity. So a big portion of that is going to be those large wood structures, some engineered, some not, to provide that complexity for fishes, as well as bank protection, flowing of water, and helping with the connection to the floodplain. And we're going to increase off-channel habitat availability. So we have those springs that are coming in below that 1040 spring line that we are going to be able to tap back into with realigning the Toppenish Creek into its historic main stem. And there are actually some other seasonal side channels that we will be able to tap back into as well. And I'll show those in maps here in a little bit. Next slide. Not only is this a restoration project, but it very much became an infrastructure project. So we want to maintain and reduce flood risk for the adjacent homes on a terrace north of the project site. And there are some homes to the south as well on another road that approaches Pom Pom. And we want to meet the Yakama Nation and Yakama County bridge standards for flood conveyance. Next slide. So I know that that was a lot of information, and I tried to just touch on it briefly, but really that was just to give a basis as well as our goals, so it's in your mind as I walk through this map here, or this aerial photo with some edits to it. So first, I want to talk about where everything is located on it. The main stem of Toppenish Creek as it stands today is outlined in a light yellow line up and downstream of the project reach, and the pink stretch of Toppenish Creek is where we want to do our enhancement and restoration. If you go north, there is an orange line that branches off of the main stem of Toppenish Creek. That is that historical, one of the historical flow paths of Toppenish Creek that still exists on the landscape today. If you go further north, there's the lime green line. That is the spring brook that comes up below that 1040 line that does connect with the historical flow path and flows through where Pom Pom Road is. If you go downstream of Pom Pom Road, there is a blue line that branches off from the orange and the green. That is one of those side channels that also was a historic flow path of Toppenish Creek, and it reconnects with Toppenish before it reaches Marion Drain Road downstream. Looking at Pom Pom Road itself, starting to the north, there is a red rectangle with white lines. That is showing one of the big project elements, which is going to put in a larger bridge up to 300 feet in length that is going to span the floodplain as well as a portion of the northern channel, that Spring Brook, and the middle channel that will be the primary alignment of Toppenish Creek. If we go further south, there are 4 yellow squares. Those are showing culverts that are going to be implemented across the floodplain to help with flood conveyance as we increase the connectivity of the channel to the floodplain, especially when we have flooding that occurs with snow melt. It will be able to be channeled through those culverts, through that bridge, and it will protect the infrastructure as well as providing a lot of that ecological uplift. All the way to the south on that pink line, there is a pink rectangle with the faint white line, if you can see it, and that is the existing bridge today. And that will stay there because we do plan to have some additional flood conveyance to go through that bridge as well. So in order for us to bump the main stem of Toppenish over into that orange line to connect to all of these things, we're going to have to build a deflection berm and a plug that is outlined as a green square and a yellow line so that primary flows do not get recaptured by this trench that exists there today. However, with designs moving forward, we haven't quite determined the year event that the current alignment of Toppenish Creek will become inundated with flow. It potentially will be a 10-year event. So again, primary flows will go down that orange line, and anything above a 10-year event or maybe another flow year event designated will still go down the main stem of Toppenish Creek to help protect the infrastructure. Slide.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat, and I was actually wanting to ask the same just while we're on this image. The red line for the bridge is located north of any of the channels indicated on this image?
That was just a little bit, so I didn't make this photo specifically. I think it was Tom or maybe even Serafina, just trying to get as close as possible while still showing all of the elements on the map. So the bridge is going to be a little bit north of those channels, but it still will tie in. If you look at the first yellow square that is kind of at the intersection of the orange, green, and blue lines, there's actually a culvert that exists there today, but it is a tremendous fish passage barrier in every sense of the word. The water scours out underneath it and under the road, so the flow is actually moving through it. There's like an 8-foot drop, and water doesn't go through there with that 8-foot drop, so fish can't get up it. So that will be replaced with a larger culvert as well that will tie into the bridge. So it still essentially will all be open in there outside of the footings of the bridge and then the culvert side, if that makes sense.
So just going off what's in the chats, the north and main channels will go through the bridge, or the bridge is north of the north and main channels?
So we are at the beginning stages of the design development. We just selected this alternative with these options. I don't have the exact locations of the bridge. It will partially go across the northern channel and close to the Springbrook before we have that 21-foot culvert, that first 21-foot culvert. And this has to do with hydrologic modeling that I'll show in a couple slides that shows that with where the water's going and the elevation across the floodplains, that a lot of the flooding water will be to the north there up to that terrace that is kind of outlined with the riparian vegetation. So that's why the firm we contracted to do this is KPFF. They designated this section as where the bridge should go for that flood conveyance. So it won't completely cross the creeks themselves. That's where the culverts will come into play.
Just on the timing piece, I
makes sense.
propose maybe moving on to questions and answers around 10:20, if that works, to allow 15 minutes for that.
Okay. Do you just want me to keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll try and wrap this up really quickly. Sorry, there's a lot of information with this project, and I'm trying to be succinct. Next slide, Danielle. This is just to show that elevation before we get to the hydrologic modeling. I'll refer to what we selected as alternative B for the bridge and 4 culverts. This is showing the elevation of the road as well as the channel as it crosses under the road from left to right. So all the way to the left is showing where the 300-foot bridge is going to go. We are going to have to raise the road a little bit just to help with flood conveyance because that's where a majority of the water is going to go. And you can see that based just on the elevation profile as we move to the right. As you move to the right from where the bridge is going to go, so you're probably between 600 and 700 feet to the right of where the bridge is going to go, and that's going to be the first culvert where the existing fish passage barrier is. And if you continue to move to the right, you see 3 more notches. That is going to be the 3 additional culverts to help with flood conveyance at a higher year event. In this one, it's showing a 500-year event. And then going all the way to your right is showing the current location of the main stem of Toppenish Creek, and that will still have water in it as well. And we can come back to this slide some more to focus on it some more if everyone didn't get a good chance to look at it. Next slide. So this is the little bit of hydrologic modeling that already has been done. So we have KPFF that is doing the bridge designs and infrastructure, and then we have Interfluve that is doing the restoration designs, and they are working closely together. So when we chose alternative B, which is going to be the 300-foot bridge that is going over that a good chunk of the floodplain as well as a portion of the northern channel that was designated in blue. That is that first notch in Pom Pom Road, and you can see with the higher velocity flows being shown in the yellows and reds where that northern channel is. So it does look like, based on this one, that it is going to go through where the bridge is going to go. And then if you continue south along that road, you hit these 4 more notches. That is where those 21-foot culverts are going to go. One on that middle channel and where the spring line is going to reconnect, and then the 3 that are further south of that for additional flood conveyance. And then going all the way to the south, you can see the main stem. Today's current main stem of Toppenish Creek still has a lot of water coming through it as well. And this is what it would look like at a 100-year event. But the important thing is water isn't overtopping the road, and it is going through all of those historic flow paths and those notches in the road that were selected by KPFF. Next slide. I just wanted to touch on, with all of that in mind, that there are big project benefits coming out of this. Not only are we going to be realigning into the historic channel, we're going to be reconnecting and enhancing 2.4 miles of main and side channels that has a lot of good existing habitat that is still there and we want to save. There's still that dense riparian habitat. There's still all of that complexity that we can tie back into with moving the creek over. As well as there are some existing wetlands downstream of Pom Pom that we would like to tie into as well that were identified in a wetland assessment done 2 years ago. We're going to reconnect to that cold water steep. We're also going to have reconnection to about 100 acres of floodplain with natural flooding in the spring. I already mentioned that we're going to reconnect to that existing riparian zone, and this is going to increase the abundance and quality of steelhead and lamprey habitat. That is going to benefit multiple life stages, not just provide a migratory route to spawning reaches upstream. This will also benefit wildlife and the riparian forest. So this next slide, and I'll try to be quick, is just showing that we do have a lot of funding already secured for this project. We have funding and partners with BPA, YZIP, NRCS. We had the Corridor Enhancement Plan. We've used funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services for design. And there are two pie charts showing that we have two pots. So one is the restoration side with designs and construction, and that bottom pie chart is for the designs and construction of the bridges and improvement of utilities. This is a good chunk of money, and we're obviously here today also to apply for $1.9 million from Surf Board, but we will also be actively pursuing other funding pots as well, and talking with our internal resource programs to find additional funding there as well for the infrastructure side of things. Our rough timelines is that we are wanting to have completed designs, final in hand, ready for construction, late spring, early summer of 2023. We know it's a really tight timeline, and I have had this discussion with Elizabeth that there is concern in regards to that, to have permit level ready by, I think it was December 1st. Good news on that is that we just received yesterday conceptual designs from Interfluve for restoration, so bridge should not be far behind for the first level of review. So if our review process wraps up quickly, especially with BPA, who is handling the environmental compliance side of things, as well as NRCS, we should be on time to get those permit level designs by December for this pot of money. And then the goal would be to start construction June 1st of 2023, with the thought that we might have to phase it, but we really want to tackle a lot of those bigger elements with the infrastructure and large woody debris structures in stream before bumping the creek over. Next slide. So this is just a rundown of the permitting and approval. We wanted to throw that in here and keep it in here because those were questions asked in PRISM. We are going to be going through BPA environmental compliance. They're most likely going to take the lead over NRCS due to the amount of money they're contributing. We have those programmatic documents that we're going to be going through instead of individual assessments or biological assessments. We are going to be working with EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers for those permit pathways. And we're going to have our own internal permit with water code. Cultural clearance actually is already underway because this project has been on the docket for quite a while. We are going to do Section 106 compliance with BPA, and our archaeologist, Serafina Sperry, is working with our TIPO office and the Cultural Resource Program and the Cultural Committee. We've already been on site to do multiple surveys and working with landowners and those programs to identify and protect any resources. This last one really just pertains mostly to internal processes with Yakama Nation, but we have a monthly IDT meeting where we just present this project to get feedback from other resource programs. Next slide. We wanted to touch on that we do continual community outreach as well as talking with those landowners. This is something that I discussed with Elizabeth, so wanted to touch base on it again. We meet with utility representatives from the utility companies, water, power, and communication on site. We've met with public safety and emergency personnel to address any egress and ingress routes for emergency services as well as for fire. We do have permissions from landowners, which we obtain working with Land Enterprise and Yakama Nation Realty. We have someone that goes out with a letter we draft up explaining the goals of the project, and they sign in favor, and when we have the majority we can move forward, which we do have the majority in favor. And we'll continue to have those tours and meetings with landowners at a minimum at set design levels. So we're at conceptual right now, which is 30%. And then we'll share that with the community after our review. And then the next level, 60 to 80, and then draft final and final, we'll share with them to keep them in the loop every step of the way. Next slide. I really don't need to touch on the community concerns and proposed resolutions unless anyone wants to hear about them. These were just things that we have heard about since 2019 that we plan to address as part of our design criteria. But these slides were really for tribal council. Besides those, if no one wants to hear about them, that is the end of this presentation. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to share a few other slides that shows a polygon of the area of projected effect, as well as a cost estimate slide, but that is all in Prism as well, showing how much this project will cost as well as what we are requesting.
Becca had a request to see the slide just before this one again.
Which slide is that? Is that you're on, Danielle?
This is the right one. I'm curious about if people asked you about the creek going dry. It's interesting.
Sorry, I barely heard that. What was that?
It's the slide with community concerns, and I was just curious to read your response to the creek going dry and the cattle grazing.
Oh, gotcha. Yes. So this current stretch of Toppenish Creek that's going through that canyon essentially is now drying up on an annual basis. Previous to my starting to work with the Yakama Nation in 2019, it didn't always go dry, but these last 3 years it has, so that is a concern. So hoping to bump the creek back over into the historic main stem with access to the riparian vegetation, hoping to increase shading. We do acknowledge that there's going to be some evapotranspiration, so maybe it'll even out there. But it'll have shade, it'll have connection to a spring that actively comes up and I have not seen go dry. Maybe Danielle has known of a time that it's gone dry. I'm not sure, but where that ties in, the hopes is that it'll remain inundated longer, as well as spreading out those flows that will go into the groundwater and come back up to provide areas of refuge into those hotter months for steelhead and lamprey. But we wanted to acknowledge that it was a question that we had community members ask us, why are we going to do this if it dries up every summer? So there are those aspects, but also steelhead and lamprey still do use this reach during the other seasons of the year. We haven't seen active spawning from steelhead. Really has to do with the lack of habitat in there. There's not really a lot there for them, but they do use it as a migratory route to get the spawning upstream. And we have seen juvenile steelhead in there in the pools as it's drying up, trying to find areas to rear and stage. For the effects on the cattle grazing, we do have to take into consideration that these allotments that the project spans are used as rotational grazing grounds. We are working with the current landowners and some lessees that have cattle in there intermittently to put up fencing and to provide a stockwater pond to the south of the project area so that the cattle will have access to water but won't be in the active floodplain, as well as where we plan to restore and do live plant revegetation. We don't expect it to have any negative impact on the cattle pastures because as it stands, they really can't keep the cows in there very often or for very long because there isn't water when it dries up or there isn't a lot for them to eat. So it expects to improve the area with raising the water table locally.
A question, are there any concerns from the community or stakeholders that would put the implementation of this project at risk, or are folks largely in support of this effort?
So when you're saying concerns of putting this project at risk, are you asking that from the standpoint of the infrastructure or from the restoration?
Either really. I'm just trying to determine, are there any showstoppers out there that, you know, basically someone could come in and say, we're not doing that. This is Jen O'Neill.
Gotcha. I think the only showstopper would be if we, the community was concerned that we would start construction and then run out of money for the infrastructure elements, and then it would just be closed for a longer period of time while we gathered more funding to finish the infrastructure. But that isn't the case, and we would not move forward to start working on putting in the bridge and those culverts until all of the funding was secured to do that construction, if that makes sense. So that would be the biggest showstopper, and that's why we are presenting this today to ask for that $1.9 million to help offset some of those costs with the restoration side, and then our other pots of money would be going more to the infrastructure itself. In all reality, with what we're wanting to do, the cost increase really just comes from those bridges and the fact that there is a water main that runs along the road that we will have to incorporate into the designs of the bridge and the culvert. So it skyrocketed that cost, and that would be the showstopper.
Thank you.
Just two questions from Katie in the chat. First is, what's the reasoning behind not decommissioning the road? There seems to be a lot of infrastructure needed.
I'm sorry, I heard someone's notification go off the same time as your question, so I didn't catch that.
I think it was mine. What's the reasoning behind not decommissioning the road? There seems to be a lot of infrastructure needed.
Right. It had to do that it is a primary route to a cemetery that is to the south. So there was that, and then there were huge concerns about having routes for safety in the events of fires. That was a really big one, and you know, as we have all seen year after year, fire intensity is increasing. The length of our fire seasons are increasing, and just alone in the reservation the last couple of weeks, I've seen 7 that occurred, and so they really wanted to have this access route open, and that was when we were meeting with public and safety personnel on site. That was a big one, and then they would also have additional areas to get water for their water trucks. Other was just emergency routes. We have elders that are out there and wanted to make sure that they had all the resources available to them that they needed. And then there is that water main that goes under the road. And we were pursuing the idea of finding ways to encase the water main to have it running across the floodplain so there would still be access during drier portions of the year while the road was decommissioned. However, that wasn't as preferable as hanging it along the infrastructure and protecting it for easier access, because the water main is part of the loop that goes around Pom Pom Road, the roads that connect to it to the north and south, and then the road that is to the west on Signal Peak, that it creates this loop to keep the water moving so they don't have it stopping up anywhere and collecting any chemicals, any debris. White Swan is severely water limited, and so we did not want to mess with that. So leaving the road in with this infrastructure is going to take care of all of those concerns. They'll have access to the cemetery. They'll have emergency routes for fire as well as medical services for the elders. It's not going to cause any issues with the loop of that water main that provides the majority of the water to the community out there, and we can still hit those restoration goals.
Thank you. Second question is, what flows in CFS go through these channels seasonally, and how will the flows be split at the 2-year flow? How will the flows split at low flows?
So they want to, I think the guess is to split the flow at a minimum of a 10-year going down the historic alignment, and having anything above a 10-year going down the current canyon, excuse me, as it were. That'll help with protecting the infrastructure as well as, you know, helping with some of other community concerns. Annual CFS, I don't know why I just blanked on that. Danielle, could you help me with that real quick?
What was your question?
Annual flows and CFS for Toppenish. I had like a bunch of numbers pop into my brain and I know it's the wrong one.
Yeah, my recollection is just looking at the hydrograph. I think in the late season it's about 20 CFS, but it can go as much as, I'm going to maybe be wrong on this, but you know what? How about I take a look at that? Because I'm more order of magnitude.
We have a few more questions left, but we are having our next sponsors join us at 10:45 and have a break scheduled for 10:35. How do people feel about if you'd like to remain on and discuss these remaining questions during that 10-minute period, or if you'd like to take a break? Does that sound like a good option for the next 10 minutes until our next sponsors join?
I'd like to keep going. I think we still have some questions, and we need to know the answers in order to evaluate it fairly, I think.
Okay. All right.
That's my vote.
Okay. Yeah.
So my question, I'm just going to jump in, Michael. I hope that's okay. I think a lot of our questions are similar that I'm seeing in the chat. And so I wonder if there's, you've got the modeling, which is really helpful. If you have any hydraulic modeling that shows existing conditions and proposed conditions under maybe, a couple different flow scenarios, I was surprised that it doesn't look like the 300-foot bridge will be over the main channel. So I'm still trying to catch up and wrap my head around that.
Gotcha.
The 100-year events look pretty fast through those culverts that will be conveying the 100-year flow in the model results we saw. So, just getting a better understanding of the whys behind the placement of those different types of structures would be really helpful to me. That you probably have, I'm guessing, if you've got the 100-year model results. So hopefully that's not too big of an ask.
No, I can definitely provide those with the help of Interfluve. We went with this route of the bridge and its location having to do with the elevation. So if you're looking at slide 17 again, that is showing the elevation profile of the road as well as where the landscape is under the road. Where that bridge is going to go is the lowest point of elevation in that landscape. And then as we move to the south along that road, the elevation drastically increases. And so that's kind of where the placement of the bridge ended up because of that. And then when you're looking at the hydrologic model, that shows a little bit better the channel itself. It's shown with the higher velocity of those flows going through, where it even splits off and goes through that 300-foot chunk, that it's still going to cross over where the Springbrook is going to be coming in, the middle channel where it's approaching Pom Pom Road, and there is that side channel that was that blue line on the downstream, so that does connect and pass through where the big bridge is going to go. Then there's the other channel that branches off. It's that orange line that went through that culvert. And I know that's kind of hard to follow when I'm just explaining it, when I'm looking at it, and I'm not like there with you in person kind of pointing it out, so I apologize for that.
Danielle's pulling up hydrographs, but it'd be really useful to see the cross-section and to see the flow model that had the channel depths, just because they speak to what you're talking about. I don't know if Danielle's able.
No worries.
Danielle, is it possible to see those two slides? I know you're pulling up the hydrograph too.
I'm looking.
Okay. I didn't mean to stop things. I was just, it's clear that the orange line is in a different location than the channel on the LiDAR. And just from what I remember of your cross section, the channel under the bridge is actually quite large. In fact, probably the dominant channel. Is that correct, Shawna?
So close. So the orange channel is still in the correct placement. It's just when the orange channel approaches Pom Pom Road and reconnects with that green spring line, and then is showing another channel downstream going through where that big bridge is going to go. That all connects, and those are all historic channel scars. So there's still going to be a lot of flow with flooding across the floodplain, as well as just in that historic channel that branches off from the orange, going more to the north. That is showing a lot of that heat on the hydrologic graph.
You know, if you go to the image that you just passed of flood inundations, sorry,
It's
I
okay.
think this is our most accurate sense of the channels going through the big bridge graph, because the other one shows that culvert splitting across the high ground that's not even wetted at the 100-year flow. So one of the lines is clearly going through the bridge, and then if you go to the next slide with the cross section.
That would be the slide previous to it.
That biggest gap in terms of flood conveyance capacity is the one way on the left. That's where the bridge goes, right?
Yes,
so
that is correct.
Yeah. So the low flow channel is small there, but the high flow channel carries much more water than the much more incised channels elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yes.
So at flood flows, the majority of water is going under the bridge.
Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to confirm that because I think we were getting slightly.
Yeah, sorry. This is difficult to present in this platform. I do apologize for that.
Just wanted to say, related to that graphic, there was a question from Becca about the velocities through the culverts are shown as significantly higher than above and below the culverts. Will the culverts be velocity barriers to any life stages at any flows?
We are going to, well, not me specifically, but that is something that was presented to Interfluve, and they're going to be working with KPFF to make sure that, to design to the best of their abilities that they do not become fish passage barriers for any life stage. So I think the plan for the 21-foot culverts is that they're all going to be the same, so it'll be one set of designs to review, which will help in that aspect, and then Interfluve will maybe do aprons or something to that effect based off of what I've seen them do previously. But it's hard to answer that in full when we aren't that far on designs yet.
Shawna, do you think, are you at a point where you can make, kind of an assurance in the grant proposal that they would not be? So that's something that we can consider in our review.
Yes, especially because we just got 30% designed yesterday, and I haven't been able to open them up, but it should address those along with the basis of design report.
Thanks.
And Becca, you also had a question about constraints on the length of the road to treat. Has that been answered?
No, early in the presentation, you mentioned that this was the section of road that was accessible to you to work on, and I was curious about where that constraint came from.
It has to do with where the historic maps are showing the flows of Toppenish Creek as well as the terrace. So directly on either side, one on the terrace to the north and then a little bit to the south on a road that connects to Pom Pom are houses. So it had to do with the allotments, the community that lives out there, and there's actually a portion of Pom Pom Road to the south that is in question of who owns and maintains it. There's a section with the right-of-ways to the south that it's up for debate, whether it's the counties or tribal. So it was easier to focus in on this stretch, a half-mile of Pom Pom Road where it crosses with the landscape and human constraints on either side, if that makes sense.
It does, thanks.
Question, so if Q2 goes down the current channel, where does it end up since there is a plug in that channel?
With the current main stem? The current main stem travels downstream and intersects with what is called Marion Drain Road with another bridge downstream, if that was your question.
Yeah, I guess I understand then that the plug is designed to be small enough that it overtops at Q10. Is that
Oh,
correct?
I see what you're saying. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I misunderstood your question. So yeah, so there will be a designed plug and berm that will bump the primary flows over to that to the lower elevation floodplain and existing channel scars, and then the plug will be designed at a level that at certain flow paths it will overtop but will not scour out. So there will be a little bit more design that goes into that now with this new direction.
Okay. Thanks.
I think maybe time for 1 to 2 more questions, and we should probably take a quick break. We are going to start the next presentation about 5 minutes late, but there's a question here. Is there a concern at low flows that splitting the channels would result in very shallow flow in the north and middle channels, or would the spring input supplement that enough?
The spring will supplement a little bit, but it's not going to be so significant that you're going to have higher CFS. It'll be enough to provide refuge and cold water for the fishes. The water will not split, but between the historic channels, I think they're going to design it where it goes through one or the other at a certain velocity. So outside of that, without seeing, opening up the conceptual to see how that is starting to fall out, I don't have a better answer.
Thank you. Is there any final questions for Shawna at this point before we just take a very quick break and then jump in on Kittitas County and Western Rivers Conservancy's presentation? See one more from
He
Katie.
has a
Was there ever
question
an
in the
alternative?
chat. Was there ever an alternative to move the road upstream and have just one crossing?
There was a brief proposal about doing something like that, but it was decided that we didn't want to construct more infrastructure and more of a road prism on the landscape than already exists. There already is a road upstream of this that is a significant route up into the closed area, and then same for routes to the east. So there are enough routes, but they still have routes around it. We didn't need to build a whole new road, but they still wanted this one for all of the concerns from the community that I listed earlier.
Thank you very much, Shawna. I wanted to thank you and Danielle for persevering in the face of technical difficulties, and I think this is helpful for people to understand the project. I'm happy to convey any other additional questions to you that members of the committee may have, so feel free to send those my way either via chat or email or however else you may choose, and we'll get those answered.
I just highlight, since Shawna can't see the chat, Elizabeth noted, if you can get her the PowerPoint that you're going to present originally and the designs you just received today and the accompanying basis of design report, it would be great for her to add those to Prism so people can review those prior to the 20th. And she also noted that she also noted that you may want to make sure your grant request incorporates worst case scenarios for cost escalation, especially as relates to some other funding sources we might be able to bring in.
I think right now what we have for estimates is that we had a pretty solid cost estimate for this project in 2020, and we bumped it up by 33% for inflation, and we'll look at if we need to increase that number at all for increase in cost for construction, that being part of the worst case scenario.
Great, thank you very much.
I just want to say real quick, thank you so much for bearing with me during the technical difficulties, and I'm happy to provide any and all information as the questions come through.
Great. Thanks again. So at this point, would it be okay with our next sponsors if we maybe reconvene at 10:55 just to give people time for a quick break before doing so?